Good morning. So thanks very much to the organizers, especially to Jean-Pierre and Eric for this very kind invitation. It's always a great pleasure to come back to Hong Kong, especially for this kind of opportunity where I can meet many old friends and discuss many topics that have been evolving very quickly since I left Hong Kong 2 years ago. This paper is very preliminary, so I apologize for its kind of unproblematized and rather descriptive nature. I always feel that the odd one out in a conference like this with many political scientists, I'm going to sort of more tell a kind of narrative story. I was slightly consoled to hear Chris Patton yesterday say that he has always doubted the existence of political science, so that kind of made me feel a little better. But then a little further down the line, he also said that he also always doubted the existence of identity, which he sees as a kind of sort of slim or thin disguise of power, power struggles or power relationships. So that, if I pursued down that way, that would sort of empty my paper of its content. No, I wanted to take this opportunity to reflect on the 20 years since the handover by looking at the prehistory of the movements that I've studied previously, the umbrella movement and the localist discourse. So I'm going to sort of, as I said, tell a kind of story about what happened before those movements. While the narrative about the history of Hong Kong since the handover often focuses on political battles, I'm going to look at the kind of cultural side. Since the handover, to say it very quickly, of course, things have, the discussion has been dominated by these political debates, and at the same time, Hong Kong society has remained very conservative. I think the recent judgments show us how conservative, how deeply conservative large parts of Hong Kong society have remained. I think we saw in many of the papers yesterday how hard it can be to pin down objective factors of change. Whether we look at the social mobility or whether we look at the economic evolution, it's very hard to sort of really put your finger on what has really changed since the handover, and it does seem at the same time that many things have changed. So what I want to focus on is what I call cultural activism. So the first definition of this idea of cultural activism comes through the discourse of these groups that began to emerge in Hong Kong society, who promoted a narrative of cultural awakening, which I think sort of constitutes a very nice opposition with this idea, although they don't usually formulate it this way, with this idea of a deep frozen handover. So the idea is that, of course, Hong Kong society has been deep frozen in the colonial state, and the mechanisms of colonial hegemony have been carried over with no change into the decolonized, post-colonial, or recolonized state, whatever you wish to call it. So against this idea of deep freezing, we have this idea of awakening, where activists try to promote an alternative vision in which citizens could become increasingly aware of the hegemonic mechanisms underpinning the political disenfranchisement and the economic inequalities that were arguably part and parcel of what the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law were designed to preserve, and which they have so far quite successfully preserved in a certain way. So just to clarify what I mean by cultural activism, I use a definition from William Sewell, defining culture as a dimension of practice devoted to the making of meaning, a symbolic dimension of practice. So this, I think, is very useful to understand how these movements, which all have political and economic aspects, but they also have symbolic dimensions, and many of them are very strongly symbolic and in fact have less political or directly political content, and in fact often have no connection to China, which is always the kind of elephant in the room when we're discussing the evolution of Hong Kong. But many of these movements in fact have almost no or no connection to China. So cultural activism then refers to the mobilization of cultural symbols to redefine the legitimate values of the community, to provide it with new meanings. And this, of course, leads in Sewell's dichotomy to the second meaning of culture, which is no longer culture as opposed to the cultural dimension, as opposed to the economic or political dimension, but culture as the shared characteristic of one society as opposed to another society, what he calls a distinct universe of meaning, which, of course, is the second dimension of cultural activism, which sort of more ties up with what Malte was talking about just now. So a series of contentious movements have taken place. Oh yes, and what I wanted to say here is that I think framing this issue in terms of culture can also help us see identification or identity in a less reified and a more fluid way. I think culture very, very clearly brings through this idea that culture is constructed. It's not something that is sort of pre-existent and unchangeable, but it's something that is constructed through these movements and through these discourses. So a series of contentious movements have taken place since the handover that are concerned with symbolic or meaningful dimensions of Hong Kong as a polity and society. In particular, a series that are usually summarized as the heritage protection movement. So milestones of the heritage movement include campaigns to resist the redevelopment of Leto Street or Wedding Cart Street, Star Fair Pier and the Queen's Pier, Shekit Mei and Outdog public housing estates, and Tsui Ying Tsuen Village, which was destroyed to make place for the high-speed rail line. The loose group Local Action, Bentu Xingdong, that formed around the Piers movement in 2006 was the first to bring the term local back into political discussions. Just as background, we should remember that cultural activism is certainly not new in the Chinese context. The May 4th movement aimed, as Lu Xun wrote in the preface to Outcries, to change people's spirit, although people tend to forget that when Lu Xun refers to this agenda, he talks about it as a failed project. In the tradition of Chinese political thought, particular attention has been paid to the potency of moral transformation in bringing about political outcomes. And indeed, cultural activism was strong in Hong Kong during the colonial era. Contrary to the myths of an apolitical or floating city, the social and political protests of the 60s were followed by specifically cultural or symbolic protests in the 70s, strongly connected to Hong Kong's pan-Chinese identity and directed against oppressive aspects of the colonial system. Let me skip down a little here to not lose too much time. Since the handover, different sets of discourses have emerged about the symbols of the Hong Kong community, which are no longer strongly connected to the Chinese nation, but rather reveal a preference for infranational, vernacular forms that eschew state-prescribed identities. These cultural discourses did not emerge in movements that had direct connections with China's policies, but represent a kind of positive articulation of Hong Kong's own culture. These movements also have some connections around Asia. I won't really have time to dwell on this, but there are similar movements that have taken place in Taiwan, even in Guangzhou, the Ninglu and Li Wan heritage preservation movement, preservation of Cantonese language. So this also kind of questions some of the borders that we are looking at here. Broadly speaking, I would summarize these movements as a critique of what Long Yingtai called Hong Kong's central values, which I think can be summarized around 3 points. A capitalist property-led development model, a productivist and functionalist technocratic model of urban planning that does not include communities, which I like to summarize as seeing like a state, using James Scott's words, or Rem Koolhaas's generic cities, and finally a historical narrative that focuses on the nation state and high culture, which is rejected in favor of an alternative collective memory. So under the slogan, Hong Kong history written by Hong Kong people. So in this perspective, the heritage protection movement may retrospectively be seen as a kind of defining moment in shaping the values of a new generation of activists, and as a prelude to the anti-national education and umbrella movements, or even, as argued by Kiang Tong, as the beginning of a movement to reshape the cultural values of Hong Kong society. So I want to walk you through some of these movements, and sorry for those who are very familiar with them already. As I said, this is going to be a little bit descriptive, but I see this evolution as a kind of snowball. Each of these movements kind of gathered a new set of values and a new set of discourses, and they kept rolling on and gathering more ideas and more momentum. And at the end, they, of course, developed into full-fledged political movements. So the Leto Street protection movement that took place from 2003-2004 was the kind of foundational moment. So of course there are other heritage movements before that, but I don't want to lose too much time. We can come back to those if there's interest in discussing that. Leto Street, I think, really marked a kind of turning point in the understanding of Hong Kong culture. It first began as a classic expropriation compensation issue. So most of you are familiar with Leto Street in Wan Chai, known as Wedding Card Street, where a lot of printing shops had set up in the 1960s, 70s, which printed wedding cards and other invitations. So a lot of people had personal connections with this place, but it was architecturally unremarkable, speaking in the kind of bureaucratic discourse of the Hong Kong administration, 5-story Tonglao buildings with no specific features, and it was not also a kind of very old site. It was, Leto Street had developed as a printing, marriage, wedding card printing place in the 60s and 70s, as I said, so it was not something that was pre-war or very connected to Hong Kong's origins in any way. So what happened in the course of this movement is that the compensation, the claim for compensation was reframed as an issue of collective memory and non-elite or vernacular heritage that was being sacrificed to property-led urban renewal. Well, as an aside, of course, the final project was inaugurated last year and certainly fulfilled the critics' worst expectations in creating a horrific, mock-ancient, commercialized heritage-themed street replica. But in this process, the old shops became a kind of emblem of first this kind of non-elite heritage that had always been ignored by Hong Kong elites, and at the same time a symbol of the collusive relationship between government regulars and real estate promoters, which was seen to be at the heart of the Hong Kong economic model. So this coincided with this book published by Alice Poon called Land and the Ruling Class, which is a rather kind of boring book by a former property developer, which became an absolute bestseller when it was first published in 2007, and it got a Chinese translation, it got a second English edition, everyone was reading it, so this idea of real estate hegemony developed out of Alice Poon's book. So against this idea of ensuring prosperity through real estate and urban infrastructure and so on, activists now advance this anti-materialist claim: the community is not for sale. So this is how the issue of compensation, or lack thereof, was reinterpreted as a symbol of the hegemonic structures of colonial Hong Kong, which had always overlooked the meaning produced by everyday lives of ordinary citizens. So I've put a little quote from Zhu Haidek here, who became famous during this movement. It established that residents did not only have exchangeable property rights, but also participatory rights as users of urban space. So this brings us on to the second movement, or the second largest movement, the Star Ferry and Queens Pier movements, so Star Ferry Pier and Queens Pier, which took place over pretty much a year from 2006 to 2007. These are much more studied in the literature. There are many studies of the Queens Pier movement in particular. To go very quickly, these movements established a new set of civil society organizations and new repertoires of actions, which Edmund has written about. The two piers underwent a kind of symbolic reappropriation by the activists, which effectively redefined their meanings. And what's interesting is that each pier was given a kind of specific meaning in this new symbolic contention. So the Star Ferry Pier was reinterpreted as a symbol of Hong Kong's everyday history, while Queens Pier was construed as a symbol of public space and inclusive identity. So Star Ferry was reconnected with the 1966 protests, the hunger strike that had taken place to protest against the ticket price raise, and the Star Ferry. Of course, the Star Ferry itself is a kind of symbol of working class Hong Kong. Before the first cross harbor tunnel was built in 1972, many people used this on a daily basis. And interestingly, so Zhu Huidik, who was again strongly involved in this protection movement, argued that the 1966 protest, which was traditionally seen as an anti-colonial protest, marked the beginning of Hong Kong's civil society. So just to quote here, since 1966, it's always the same history of Hong Kong citizens coming out and saying no to irrational policies. We want to write Hong Kong history again, but not the simplistic history of the fishing village becoming a financial center, but a history in which Hong Kong people will stand up and fight for freedom, human rights, and democracy. So although the protesters refuted the idea of collective memory, I can go into that if there's interest in exploring that debate further. I do think that in Halbach's terms and more theoretical terms, we can use the idea of collective memory to describe this reinvention of Hong Kong history related to the pier. Queen's Pier was given a different role. Of course, by its name alone, it was more closely connected to colonial rule and had to be reinvented as a kind of inclusive public space. So what was highlighted by the protesters was that it was a place where older people like to meet and play games, where foreign domestic workers like to congregate on Sundays, etc., etc. So were artistic performances, all sorts of theories to explain that this was in fact a place that belonged to all the Hong Kong people. Let me move on. The public housing estates are also very important, but I think we can come back to those in questions if there's interest. I want to mention in passing the Cantonese language activism which developed around this time in the Hong Kong Literature Museum Initiative. And interestingly, the Cantonese language activism came from Guangzhou at this point. So if you recall, in 2009-2010, there was this piece of news when the Asian Games were to be held in Guangzhou that local TV would stop broadcasting in Cantonese. There were strong protests in Guangzhou linked to the preservation of Eninlu and Liwan Historical District. And this actually then spilled over to Hong Kong. So there is a case that maybe Chin Wan would like this idea that localism actually comes from the mainland and not from Hong Kong. So just to give you a quote from the manifesto for setting up the Museum of Hong Kong Literature, in the face of high rents and at their own expense, some Hong Kong people persist in running bookshops and literary salons in order to promote interest in literature. But this is not enough. We need more sustained efforts to create long-lasting and far-reaching effects. We need a public space that enhances, through Hong Kong literature, our understanding about our identity, our society, and our past in relation to the wider world. So you see how these themes sort of always come back. Third case, the anti-high-speed rail movement. So this, of course, is also quite well known. This took place in relation with the demolition of Tsoi Yun Tsuen village and the construction of the high-speed rail line. So again, this issue crystallized several complicated questions that are related to the critiques I mentioned earlier. So first of all, the unprecedented cost of the Hong Kong segment due to the choice of planning. Other plans were rejected. I think Kenneth was in Lechko at the time, which would have cut the cost in half at least, proposed by various civil society groups. The lack of transparency around various regulatory issues connected to China in this case, including the co-location issue, which of course now has exploded. And finally, the destruction, relocation of this tenant farmer village in the new territories. So since of course the new territories vested interest bodies had no interest in defending a tenant farmer village, since these were tenants and not the indigenous rights holders of the new territories, local action, this group I already mentioned, again became involved in this protest and staged various activities which culminated in the prostrating walk or the Kuxing and the Surround Lechko movement in early January of 2010. Of course, this brings again together many of the themes I mentioned. What I want to highlight here is two new ideas. One is the victimization of the very poorest of Hong Kong citizens, the tenant farmers. So this kind of reenacts one of the foundational traumas of colonial Hong Kong. Of course, we know that the British colonizers worked together with the New Territories clans to develop that area, and of course it was the first time round that this kind of absurd play had been acted out when these tenant farmers who were completely deprived of any rights were used as manual labor to industrialize Hong Kong. So here this was a repeat of this kind of original economic choice that had been made. The other important aspect of this movement is the kind of rejection, the wholesale rejection of industrialization, this kind of return to a rural identity of Hong Kong. The idea that Hong Kong is about agriculture, it's about land, it's about cultivating organic rice, and so on. And there was all sorts of cultural activism, many films were made, several groups of people moved to this area. They ran for district elections in Bat Heng and I forget which year. So this kind of whole taking the cultural activism movement to the countryside idea. This is really the new aspect of this anti-XRL campaign. So just to conclude, well, of course, as with Leto Street, you could say that events proved that all the concerns in the anti-HighSpeed Rail project were fully justified. The already unprecedented cost has been overrun. The legal issues were never sorted out and are now set to be resolved through a divisive NPC decision. The Greater Bay Area integration, which was the kind of foundation of this idea of building the high-speed rail, has become a nationally approved project and a policy priority on which Hong Kong residents were never substantively consulted. This, of course, was all predictable. But to conclude on the issue of cultural activism, I would say that these movements that began in 2004 have to some extent transformed the self-representation of Hong Kong values. They have questioned the value of business efficiency, technocratic, functionalist urban planning, and the identification with pan-Chinese heritage that I mentioned earlier. Particularly interesting is how these movements question the standard distinction between citizenship and post-citizenship or identity movements. In a way, classically speaking, these would be seen as post-citizenship movements. They appear to be about identity, but in fact they are strongly connected to citizenship and the assertion of agency. They are always about inclusive planning, asserting public space, asserting citizen rights in writing history, and so on. So, to explain this kind of issue of value change, there are various theoretical angles you can take. I think Francesca Poletta's well-known theory of spheres of cultural autonomy is an interesting way to look at it, how value change comes through discourses that develop in spheres, in culturally autonomous spheres, and these spheres are often cultural spheres. They are often literary circles or literary associations or documentary filmmaker groups or occupying building groups or this kind of thing. So these counter-hegemonic ideas and identities thrive in these spaces, and then they become disseminated in society at large. So these value changes in the case of Hong Kong have both challenged and provided new impetus to the citizenship movements initiated by the previous generation of pro-democracy activists. So what I want to emphasize as a conclusion is that it's worth emphasizing that the localist ideas that emerged from the heritage protection movement and the cultural activism did not, or for the most part, have no connection with the Chinese state, with the exception of the Greater Bay Area Plan, which was the origin of the high-speed rail project. But they represent a positive articulation of local history and of the symbols of the local community. 20th century history is re-articulated as an ongoing struggle of ordinary people against colonial and post-colonial capitalism. Nonetheless, on a deeper level, the values that these movements articulate are, of course, completely contradictory with those promoted by the Chinese government. The priority of economic development, industrialization, nationalism, urbanization, non-inclusive technocratic planning, and not least a highly instrumental view of cultural heritage. So in this sense, of course, these movements already contained the potential for conflict that they later fully expressed. Thank you.